Welcome to The Structure, your weekly intelligence briefing on the business and political headlines that moved markets. I'm your host. Let's dive into this week's key developments. Global equities and tech. The S&P 500 and Nasdaq pulled back from record highs on a busy earnings week, with tech stocks falling. However, Nvidia hit an all-time high, driven by AI sector momentum. South Korea's Kospi reached a record as chip stocks rallied, with South Korea overtaking the United Kingdom to become the world's eighth largest stock market, with Korea at about $4.04 trillion versus the UK at about $3.99 trillion. Qualcomm rose about 13% on reports of a potential partnership with OpenAI for smartphone processors. Oil and energy. In energy markets, Brent crude climbed to a three-week high around $111 per barrel, with WTI around $101.85 per barrel. The Iran war continues to disrupt the Strait of Hormuz, which handles roughly one-fifth of global oil supply. In a historic move, the UAE announced it will leave OPEC, effective May 1st, adding further supply-side uncertainty. Banks including Citi and Morgan Stanley lifted their oil price forecasts. BP reported first-quarter adjusted net income of $3.2 billion, more than doubling year-over-year, driven by an oil trading surge during the Iran conflict. U.S. rates and fixed income. Turning to monetary policy, the Federal Reserve held the target rate at 3.50 to 3.75% at its April 28th and 29th meeting. Chair Powell signaled the Fed could hike rates later this year if inflation persists, marking the first potential rate hike signal under his tenure. The 10-year Treasury yield rose to about 4.33%, with markets now pricing in no rate cuts until 2027 at the earliest. Wall Street dealers held their highest Treasury positions since 2007, reflecting elevated regulatory engagement ahead of potential policy shifts. U.S. fixed income showed divergence. Credit investors appeared nonchalant about the Iran war, with high-yield spreads near 284 basis points, while Treasuries traders priced in higher inflation risk. UK and Europe. In the UK, the 10-year gilt yield climbed back above 5% for the first time in a month, pressured by rising oil costs and domestic political risk ahead of the Bank of England meeting. The Bank of England held rates at 3.75% on April 27, with markets pricing potential hikes in July and September 2026 if inflation remains elevated. The BOE's updated forecasts shifted higher for inflation and weaker for growth due to the war. European stock funds attracted their largest weekly inflows since 2015, about $2.4 billion in the week ending April 26, as investors rotated into European equities. J.P. Morgan Asset Management, BlackRock, and MFS were buying shorter-term European government bonds after a sell-off, betting on higher yields before they fall as the ECB continues tightening. Japan and Asia. The Bank of Japan held rates at 0.75% in a 6-3 split vote, the widest margin under Governor Kazuo Uda. 3 of 9 policymakers voted to raise rates, fueling expectations of a possible June rate hike with about 55% implied probability. The yen initially strengthened to 158.96 per dollar before weakening back to about 159.69 as Uda gave no clear rate hike signal. The hawkish tilt underpinned broader G7 central bank expectations for tighter policy. Australian dollar slipped from a 36-year high against the yen after the BOJ decision, though AUD/JPY remained elevated at about 114.22. Gold and metals. Precious metals surged this week. Gold futures hit $4,711 per ounce, up 3.84%, driven by geopolitical safe haven demand and war-related supply disruptions. Silver futures surged 7.47% to $75.50 per ounce, with analysts pointing to a structural revaluation regime. Platinum rose 4.22% and palladium gained 5.39%. FX. The dollar remained supported by geopolitical uncertainty and energy-driven inflation pressures. The yuan held firm, with the P-box setting a slightly softer reference rate. Analysts expect yuan at about 6.80 in 3 months, as the U.S.-China summit in May approaches. Global inflation outlook deteriorating. A Reuters poll of about 500 economists covering the top 50 economies showed 44 of 50 with higher 2026 inflation forecasts versus 3 months prior, driven by the energy crisis from the U.S.-Israel-Iran conflict. Corporate earnings highlights. In corporate news, Barclays reported flat first quarter profit at £2.8 billion with a £228 million loan provision, though investment banking income rose 4% year over year. Shares fell about 3%. Nucor reported first quarter net earnings of $743 million on $9.5 billion in revenue, a quarterly shipment record, with $250 million returned to shareholders. Analysts say AWS needs more AI capital expenditure to stay dominant, according to a Jeff Bezos-backed fund. Microsoft and OpenAI renegotiated terms, allowing OpenAI to sell to Microsoft's competitors, signaling a major shift in the AI ecosystem. Political and policy. In Washington, a shooting near the White House Correspondents' Association dinner gathering on April 26 led to an ongoing federal investigation. FBI Director Patel and Acting Attorney General Blanche held a press conference announcing additional charges against the suspected shooter and called for an end to political violence and rhetoric. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt addressed the incident at the April 27 briefing. President Trump demanded ABC fire Jimmy Kimmel over a monologue delivered days before the shooting. Hollywood and late-night audiences pushed back against the demand, with Disney stock under pressure. King Charles III arrived in Washington on April 27, attending a British embassy garden party alongside Speaker Mike Johnson and Nancy Pelosi, ahead of a planned joint address to Congress. On Iran, peace talks stalled for a second consecutive week, keeping the Strait of Hormuz disruption active and oil prices elevated. The U.S. hinted it does not object to Iran participating in a World Cup, a rare diplomatic signal amid ongoing conflict. North Korea's Kim Jong-un reaffirmed support for Russia in the conflict, per state media on April 27, adding a secondary geopolitical dimension to global risk pricing. In Congress, the U.S. House on April 27 debated tax policy bills under suspension of the rules and advanced legislation to raise the Capitol Police retirement age from 60 to 65. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer spoke on the Iran war, detailing conditions and congressional oversight responsibilities related to potential military authorization. House Democratic caucus leaders held a news conference on April 28 outlining party priorities and responses to current events. What to watch? Looking ahead, the FOMC minutes from the April 28 and 29 meeting will be critical for treasuries and risk assets. Any hint at dual-direction guidance on rates will be market-moving. On Iran diplomacy, further stalls could push Brent toward $115 or higher. Any breakthrough could trigger a sharp oil correction. The Bank of Japan's June meeting, the hawkish split vote and yen weakness keep a rate hike alive. The first quarter earnings season is in full swing, with 44% of S&P 500 market cap reporting this week. Big tech results will be key for market direction. U.S. GDP data for first quarter 2026 showed the economy grew at 0.7% annualized, slower than expected, but not contracting. That's your weekly intelligence briefing. Stay informed with The Structure.